Laramie Basin, Wyoming, October, 1883. The wind already carried the scent of a brutal winter, a sharp, metallic tang that promised deep snow and deeper cold. It was this promise that made the scene at Einar Halvorsson's homestead so utterly baffling. While his neighbors were chinking walls and stacking cords of cottonwood, Einar was doing the one thing that seemed like pure madness. He was tearing out his floor, not repairing it, not replacing a rotten plank. With a grim intensity that bordered on obsession, the quiet Norwegian was prying up every single board of the perfectly good tongue-and-groove floor he had spent the previous summer laying. His two small children, Lars and Solveig, watched from the doorway, their faces pinched with confusion. His wife Astrid stood with her arms crossed, a shield against the whispers that had already begun to snake through the sparse settlement. Silas Blackwood, the man who had built half the cabins in the basin and consulted on the rest, rode up on his gelding, reining in as he saw the growing pile of expensive lumber accumulating outside Einar's door. Silas was a man whose authority was written in sawdust and sweat. He understood wood, its strengths, its limits, its soul. What he was seeing felt like a personal offense. "Halvorsson," he called out, his voice heavy with a disbelief he didn't bother to hide. "What in God's name are you doing? There's nothing wrong with that floor. I sold you that lumber myself." Einar stopped his work, leveraging a long plank free with a groan of drawn nails. He straightened his back, a tall, spare man whose movements were economical and precise. He looked at Silas, then at the gaping dark earth exposed inside his home. "The floor is good," Einar agreed, his English clipped and deliberate. "But it is wrong." Silas dismounted, his boots crunching on the hard-packed dirt. He was a practical man, a man who solved problems with adzes and saws, not riddles. "Wrong? It's a floor, man. It keeps your feet off the dirt. What could be wrong about that?" Einar gestured toward the horizon, where the mountains were already capped in white. "Winter does not come from below, Silas. It comes from all sides. A wooden floor invites it inside for dinner." The statement was so nonsensical, so contrary to a lifetime of experience, that Silas could only stare. He had built cabins from the Tetons to the Medicine Bow. He knew the rules. You build tight walls. You build a strong roof. You build a stone hearth that won't burn your claim down. And you build a solid wood floor to create a barrier between the frozen earth and the living space. It was the fundamental grammar of survival, but Einar Halvorsson wasn't just breaking a rule. He was meticulously dismantling the very foundation of established wisdom. And as Silas watched him start shoveling the dark soil out of his own home, he knew this wasn't just foolishness. It was a monument to a special kind of madness, a madness that would surely cost his family dearly when the killing cold of a Wyoming winter finally came to judge his work. The mockery had already started, and the first snows were still weeks away. The validation, if it ever came, would have to survive a trial by ice. If you're the kind of person who believes that old wisdom is sometimes the most radical innovation, then you'll want to see how this story ends. Subscribe to our channel, where we uncover one forgotten frontier technique every single week. Now let's get back to the story. The term for it settled over the community like an early frost. It started at the general store, a low-murmured joke from Jedediah Miller, a man whose opinions were as frequent as they were loud. "Heard Halvorsson's building a new kind of cabin," he'd said to a small gathering around the pot-bellied stove. "Got a new name for it. It's called a sandbox." A ripple of laughter went through the men. Halvorsson's sandbox. It was perfect. It was dismissive, slightly absurd, and it captured the childish folly of the whole endeavor. The name stuck. From that day on, Einar's homestead was no longer just the Halvorsson place. It was the sandbox. The name carried with it a payload of pity and scorn. Einar's history, had they known it, might have given them pause. He was not a farmer from the rolling fields of Norway. He had grown up in Bergen, a city of ships and sea, but his trade was not on the water. It was beside it, in the great roaring foundries that cast iron anchors and engine parts for the steamships that were changing the world. For 15 years, Einar had worked with heat, not the gentle domestic heat of a campfire, but the furious, elemental heat of molten metal. He understood furnaces, crucibles, and insulation on a level no carpenter could. He knew that the very same sand used to form the molds for 2,000-degree iron was also a masterful container of thermal energy. He had seen a sand bed, hours after a pour, still radiating enough heat to warm a room. The cold didn't care about tradition, it cared about physics. This knowledge, however, was a world away from the Laramie Basin. Here, knowledge was measured in the rings of a tree, the heft of an axe, the tight fit of a dovetailed joint. Einar's expertise was alien, and therefore suspect. The criticism wasn't just public, it became personal. Astrid's own brother, Thomas Croft, came to visit, his face a mask of strained concern. He was a good man, a rancher, who had sponsored their passage and helped them secure their claim. His disapproval was not a weapon, but a heavy blanket of sorrow. He stood inside the half-dismantled cabin, the wind whistling through the exposed foundation. "Einar," he began, avoiding his brother-in-law's eyes, focusing instead on his sister. "Astrid, people are talking. They're saying you've lost your senses." Astrid's hands tightened in her apron. "Einar knows what he is doing." Her voice was a thin thread of defiance. "Does he?" Thomas gestured at the hole in the ground. "This looks like you're digging a root cellar in your living room. You have 2 children, Astrid. Solveig is just 5. What happens when the first blizzard hits? A wooden floor is the only thing between you and the frozen ground. You know what this looks like? It looks like you don't trust your own work, Einar. Like you're so afraid of the cold you're trying to bury yourself away from it." This was the deepest cut. It wasn't an accusation of foolishness, but of fear. Of a failure of frontier competence. Einar, who had been methodically squaring the edges of the excavation with a spade, finally spoke. His voice was low and even. "This is not fear. This is physics." He looked at Thomas, his gaze direct and unwavering. "Your fire breathes from inside your house. It eats the warm air you paid for with your axe. My fire will breathe from outside. Your floor is a drum, letting the cold echo underneath. My floor will be a stone, holding the memory of the fire." Thomas just shook his head, the words meaning nothing to him. "A stone is cold, Einar. Everyone knows that." He turned back to his sister, his voice dropping to a pained whisper. "It is hard to be the town story, Astrid. Don't let his pride be the reason my niece and nephew freeze." He left a sack of flour and slab of bacon on the table, a gesture of aid that felt more like a vote of no confidence, and departed, leaving a profound silence in his wake. That night, the pressure finally cracked Astrid's composure. After the children were asleep in their small loft, she turned to Einar, her voice trembling. "He is right about one thing. It is hard to be the town story. At the store, the women, they stop talking when I approach. They look at me with such pity. They think you are endangering our children." Einar put down the tool he was sharpening and came to her. He didn't offer grand reassurances or dismiss her fears. He simply took her hand and led her to the edge of the excavation. "In the foundry," he said softly, "after we pour the iron, the sand mold glows for an hour. 6 hours later, you can still feel the warmth from a foot away. 12 hours later, The sand is still warmer than the air around it. It holds the heat. It does not forget. He squeezed her hand. This is not a floor of wood, which forgets the fire the moment it dies. This will be a floor of earth, which remembers. I am not building a sandbox, Astrid. I am building a hearth as big as our home. She looked from his earnest face to the dark rectangle of earth and then back again. She didn't understand the physics, not really, but she understood the certainty in his eyes. It was not the wild-eyed conviction of a madman, but the quiet confidence of a master craftsman. She made a choice. Winter will tell us what's wise and what's foolish, she said, her voice regaining its strength. It was a declaration of faith, not just in him, but in the coming judgment of the cold. The mockery had lasted for a month. The validation, she prayed, would last for a generation. The process was brutally simple in its materials and painstakingly precise in its execution. First, Einar had to dig. He removed the topsoil, then the dense clay beneath, until he had excavated the entire footprint of the 20 by 24-foot cabin to a depth of precisely 12 inches below the bottom of the sill logs. This alone was a monumental task, carting out nearly 12 cubic yards of earth by wheelbarrow. Silas Blackwood, riding by one afternoon, saw the mound of dirt and shook his head. Digging his own grave, he muttered to his horse. Einar wasn't just digging a hole, he was preparing a foundation for a different kind of structure. Once the excavation was complete and the floor perfectly level, he began hauling stones from the nearby Laramie River. Not large boulders, but smooth, fist-sized river rocks. He spent a week laying a 4-inch bed of these stones across the entire earthen floor. Astrid, watching him work, finally asked, "Why the stones? Sand on dirt seems simpler." Einar paused, setting a stone into place. In Bergen, boats that don't breathe rot within 5 years. Houses are the same. The earth breathes moisture. The stones give it a place to go, so it does not sour the sand or rot the logs of our home. He was creating a capillary break, a concept modern builders would recognize, preventing ground moisture from wicking up into his thermal battery. It was an elegant, intuitive piece of engineering. With the stone bed complete, the sand came next. And not just any sand. He tested samples from the riverbank, letting them dry by the fire, feeling their texture. He was looking for coarse, clean sand with minimal clay or silt content. He found what he needed a quarter-mile downstream, a large deposit of sharp-grained sand that glittered with quartz. For 2 weeks, the only sounds from the Halverson homestead were the scrape of his shovel and the squeak of his wheelbarrow. He hauled load after load, dumping it carefully over the stone bed. He didn't just dump it. He spread each layer, no more than 3 inches thick, watered it lightly to help it settle, and then began to tamp it. He had fashioned a heavy tamper from an oak log, and for days he walked the floor of his home. The rhythmic thud of the tamper compacting the sand into a dense, unyielding mass. He was squeezing out the air, maximizing the density. Air is an insulator, he wanted a conductor. He was building a single, contiguous block of thermal mass directly connected to the earth below it. Finally, after 8 solid inches of compacted sand were in place, the surface was as hard and flat as a slate floor. It was a floor made of 480 square feet of river stones and over 10 tons of carefully selected sand. The cost, which so infuriated his neighbors, who had paid dearly for milled lumber, was nothing more than his own labor. The final piece of the system was the stove. It was a standard cast-iron wood stove, but Einar installed it differently. Instead of placing it on a stone slab on top of the floor, he set it directly onto the sand itself, its legs buried a few inches deep for stability. The stove was now thermally coupled to the entire 10-ton mass of the floor. He then laid down a few simple, heavy wool rugs, leaving a wide perimeter of sand exposed around the stove. The rugs provided comfort underfoot, but the principle remained. The heat from the stove would not just radiate into the air, it would pour directly into the sand. Radiant heat would strike the floor and be absorbed. Convective heat would warm the air, which would in turn warm the walls and ceiling, which would then radiate their own heat back down to the floor. All day, as the stove burned, this massive sand battery would be drinking in the energy. He explained it to Astrid and the children one evening as the first fire in the newly configured cabin crackled. "Think of this floor as a great black pot of water," he said, using a simple metaphor. "A wooden floor is a thin tin cup. You pour heat in, and it is hot for a moment. Then it is cold again. This floor, we will pour heat into it all day, and all night it will slowly, gently give that heat back to us." He stood up and walked to the wall furthest from the stove. He placed his hand on the sand. It was cool. "Now it is empty," he said, "but tomorrow morning it will be full." This was the reframing insight. He hadn't built a floor. He had built a reservoir. He wasn't trying to keep the cold out. He was creating a system to store warmth inside. The difference wasn't subtle. It was profound. He looked at his wife and children, their faces illuminated by the firelight. Stone holds fire's warmth long after the flame dies. We will live on a warm stone. The winter of 1883 to 1884 did not arrive gently. It descended upon the Laramie Basin like a judgment. For 2 weeks in January, the sky was a sheet of leaden gray, and the temperature refused to rise above zero. Then, the blizzard hit. It came on a Tuesday, a wall of white that erased the world. The wind, a physical force that screamed down from the mountains, drove the snow into drifts that buried fences and sealed doors. The official temperature at Fort Sanders dropped to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. In the exposed basin, with the wind chill, it was a cold that felt like it could crack steel. It was a cold that tested every nail, every log, every decision a man had ever made. The winter had become the judge. Stay with me until the end, because the number that came out of this cabin, the measured difference between foolishness and genius, is something you will not forget. The crucible began. We're going to cross-cut now between two households, less than a mile apart, but existing in two different climates. Inside Silas Blackwood's cabin, a structure he himself had built, the pinnacle of conventional wisdom. The fight was desperate. The walls were tight, the roof was sound, but the cold was winning. The air near the walls was frigid. The wooden floor, raised 2 feet off the frozen ground, was a thermal leak of catastrophic proportions. Cold air pooled under the house, sucking the warmth straight through the planks. The floor was 38 degrees Fahrenheit near the hearth and below freezing at the edges. A spilled cup of water by the door had frozen into a slick, dangerous patch of ice. Silas's family, his wife and 3 sons, were huddled in a tight circle around the roaring stove. The stove was glowing a dull red, consuming seasoned cottonwood at an alarming rate. Silas had laid in 5 cords, a generous supply. A third of it was already gone. Every 45 minutes the stove demanded more fuel. The heat it produced was fierce and scorching, but it rose directly to the ceiling, leaving their feet numb with cold. They lived in a 10-foot circle of survivable warmth, while the rest of their well-built home was becoming an icebox. The difference wasn't incremental, it was a chasm. Now let's go to Halverson's sandbox. Inside Einar's cabin, the scene was one of impossible tranquility. The stove was not roaring. It was burning with a low, steady flame, consuming a single log every 2 hours. The air was not scorching near the fire and freezing near the walls. It was a consistent, even warmth that filled the entire space. Einar's children, Lars and Solveig, were not huddled in blankets. They were sitting on the wool rug in the middle of the room, in their shirt sleeves, playing with carved wooden toys. Astrid was knitting by the light of a kerosene lamp, her face calm. The source of the miracle was under their feet. The sand floor, having absorbed heat for weeks, was now a massive, gentle radiator. Einar took a thermometer, a precious instrument he had brought from the old country. The air temperature in the middle of the room was 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Near the wall furthest from the stove, it was 63 degrees Fahrenheit. The wooden walls themselves were warm to the touch. The floor, beneath the rug, was 72 degrees Fahrenheit. It was continuously releasing the vast reservoir of thermal energy it had stored. Outside, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. A difference of 90 degrees. By the third day of the blizzard, the situation in the valley was growing dire. Jed Miller, the man who had coined the term sandbox, was facing his own crisis. His woodpile was dwindling, and the wind had drifted snow up to the eaves of his cabin, making a trip for more wood a life-threatening expedition. They had closed off the main room and were all living in the 12 by 12-foot bedroom. The gut-punch detail of their hardship was a quiet, heartbreaking act of survival. To keep the fire going, Jed's wife, Martha, brought him the family Bible. It was a huge, leather-bound book, the only heirloom she had from her mother. Its pages were thick, dry, and flammable. Without a word, Jed began tearing out the pages of Genesis and feeding them to the flames, destroying his family's history to survive the night. At the Blackwood cabin, the firewood was nearly gone. Silas had burned through 2 cords in 3 days. The cold was now a palpable entity inside the house, relentless and invasive. His youngest son was coughing, a dry, rasping sound that terrified him. He had 2 choices: stay and risk his family freezing when the wood ran out, or face the storm and go for help. There was only one place to go, only one man whose work he had so publicly ridiculed. Swallowing a lifetime of pride, Silas bundled himself in every layer he owned and stepped out into the screaming white fury of the wind. The walk was a brutal, staggering battle against a force that wanted him dead. He couldn't see more than 10 feet. He navigated by memory, his beard freezing solid, his lungs aching with every breath. When he finally stumbled into the small clearing of the Halverson homestead, he could barely stand. He saw the cabin, a low shape half buried in snow, with a gentle curl of smoke rising from the chimney. Not the panicked, billowing smoke of a desperate fire, but the calm, steady exhalation of a controlled burn. He fell against the door, hammering on it with a frozen fist. Einar opened it. The sensory vindication hit Silas like a physical blow. It wasn't a blast of hot air. It was an envelope of profound, steady, silent warmth. It radiated from the floor, the walls, the very air. The brutal, shrieking wind at his back was silenced by the thick log walls. The cold that had seeped into his bones was instantly challenged by a deep, penetrating heat. He saw the impossible scene within, the children playing, Astrid knitting, the low fire in the stove. He stumbled inside, pulling off his ice-caked hat. He looked from the children in their light clothing to the placid fire, to the calm faces of their parents. He didn't understand. It defied everything he knew. He saw a tin cup of water sitting on the floor, a good 12 feet from the stove, left for the family's small dog. It was liquid. In his own house, that cup would have been a block of solid ice within an hour. That was the proof device. Simple, undeniable. Silas looked at Einar, his face a mixture of awe, shame, and utter confusion. Words failed him. The mockery, the certainty, the lifetime of experience, it all crumbled to dust in the face of this impossible warmth. He was silent for a long moment, the feeling returning to his frozen face. Then he spoke the words that signified a complete surrender of his entire world view, the 5-word admission that changed everything in the valley. Silence. Show me how you built it. He did not ask for firewood. He did not ask for shelter for his family, though he knew it would be offered. In that moment, the craftsman in him overruled the father, the survivor. He had to know. He was a man who had been wrong, completely and fundamentally wrong, and in the warm, quiet cabin of the man he had mocked, his only instinct was to learn. When the blizzard finally broke after 5 days, the Laramie Basin emerged into a world of blinding white and crystalline cold. The landscape was scoured, reshaped. So was the social landscape of the settlement. The first visitor to the Halverson place was Silas Blackwood, not seeking shelter this time, but knowledge. He arrived with his own thermometer. He spent an entire day measuring, documenting, his initial awe transforming into a craftsman's deep, analytical respect. He measured the temperature of the sand at the center of the room, 72 degrees Fahrenheit. He measured it at the furthest corner, 65 degrees Fahrenheit. He measured the air temperature at the floor and at the ceiling. The difference was less than 5 degrees. In his own cabin, that difference was over 30. He calculated Einar's firewood consumption, less than a quarter of a cord over the 5-day storm. Silas had burned through nearly 2 full cords. The numbers were stark. They were undeniable. The physics never lies. The next Sunday, after the service, the community gathered outside the small log church. This was the forum where public opinion was forged. Jed Miller, his face gaunt from his family's ordeal, was telling a harrowing story of the storm. Silas Blackwood, the undisputed authority on building in the region, waited for him to finish. Then he stepped forward. Jed's story is every man's story here, Silas began, his voice carrying over the small crowd. My family and I, we were cold. We were desperate. We burned through wood that should have lasted a month. He paused, letting the weight of that admission settle. He was confessing a failure, not of his craft, but of his understanding. Last night, he continued, I went to Einar Halverson's place. A murmur went through the crowd. They were expecting a story of tragedy, a grim confirmation of their own judgment. His children were playing on the floor in their shirts. His woodpile is barely touched. I measured the temperature in his cabin myself. It was 68 degrees. He let that number hang in the frigid air. We called his home a sandbox. We were the children. He was the teacher. He turned and looked directly at Einar, who stood quietly beside Astrid at the edge of the crowd. I was wrong. This works. That simple public admission from the most respected builder in the county was more powerful than 1,000 arguments. The mockery died instantly, replaced by a stunned, hungry curiosity. The mocking name, Halverson's Sandbox, was never spoken in scorn again. Within a year, it became a term of respect, a shorthand for a revolutionary idea. The adoption was not immediate, but it was steady, driven by the memory of hardship. That spring, 3 families, including Thomas Croft, came to Einar, not with pity, but with questions. They came to learn. Einar, a man of few words, taught them with his actions, showing them how to dig, how to lay the stones, how to tamp the sand. He never once mentioned the ridicule he had endured. His vindication wasn't in their apology. It was in their imitation. By the winter of 1885, 7 cabins in the Laramie Basin had sand floors. By 1890, it was considered the standard for any new construction in the region. Travelers passing through remarked on the unusual comfort of the homes, the surprising lack of drafts, the astonishing efficiency of their firewood use. The idea spread, carried by word of mouth, becoming a piece of regional folk wisdom whose origins were eventually forgotten by many. What Einar Halvorsen had done was not an invention, but a brilliant act of knowledge cross-pollination. He took a principle from an industrial process, foundry casting, and applied it to a domestic problem. He understood something fundamental that his peers had missed. A house is not a barrier against the cold, but a system for managing energy. He wasn't insulating against the cold, he was storing the heat. This principle, thermal mass, is now a cornerstone of modern passive solar design and energy-efficient building. Engineers and architects use concrete slabs, stone walls, and phase-change materials to achieve the exact same effect that Einar achieved with river stones and sand. He was a century ahead of his time, not because he had access to advanced technology, but because he understood first principles. He saw the truth that the earth beneath our feet is not a threat to be held at bay, but an ally, a vast, stable reservoir of temperature that can be taught to absorb the excess heat of the day and give it back during the cold of the night. The frontier didn't reward what was traditional. It rewarded what worked. And in the unforgiving court of a Wyoming winter, Einar's sandbox had proven to be a castle. A wise man doesn't fight the cold, he invites the earth to remember the warmth. If this story changed the way you think about a simple floor, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories of forgotten wisdom. And let us know in the comments, what's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? We read everyone. Disclaimer: this story is a fictionalized reconstruction inspired by historical building principles. The characters and specific events are created for narrative purposes. The engineering principles of thermal mass are real, but all construction should adhere to modern building codes and safety standards.